What's up guys, Drew here, and this is another installment in my Witchy Tales series. So please forgive me if I get emotional at any point during this one. It is the one that hits closest to home. So before I get into it, let me kind of set it up. I was always a weird child, and I'm not going to get into the specifics of how weird, but in particular, how it relates to this story. When I was a teenager, I was obsessed with contacting spirits of the dead and just the idea of psychic abilities, and just all of this just permeated every inch of my body all the time. And me and my friends often played with Ouija boards, and my mom knew this and hated it, but she knew that I had this obsession, that it manifested in other ways as well, but she understood that. And she always said from that time, when I die, I'm gonna haunt you. And I always, said, well, you better. And skip forward a bit about my mother's health. My mother had many, many health conditions, starting with, she started smoking at the age of 13. So that would have been 1963. And she didn't quit until 2010. And my mother wasn't a pack-a-day smoker. My mother wasn't a 2-pack-a-day smoker. I don't know how much she smoked, but it wouldn't surprise me in the slightest if she smoked 4 or more packs of cigarettes a day. Hardcore chain smoker. Now, of course, during times when she worked, when she had a job, she would smoke less because most of her jobs you couldn't smoke at. But there was a lot of time in her life when she was a stay-at-home mom or she was unemployed, and she just smoked all day, every day. She also had diabetes and high blood pressure, and there were other little things, but those are the main things. My mother's health was sort of in decline, and one Wednesday in June of 2011, earlier in the month, I was going out. We were living with my parents at the time, and I was going out with my husband somewhere, and so I went to tell my mother I was leaving, and she was in the restroom, and when she opened the door, the look on her face, I don't know how to describe it. I can't describe it. I can still see it, but I can't describe it. And I asked her if she was okay, and she told me she didn't feel good. She was nauseous. She had pain. She thought maybe she had a hiatal hernia. And I said, you need to go to the doctor. And she said, well, I have an appointment next Wednesday. And I said, okay. And I left. And when I got in the car, I looked at my husband and I said, my mother has lost the will to live. That's what I said to him. The following Wednesday, my mother went to her doctor's appointment. She went to the base hospital because she is the wife of a retired Marine, and that's where they went. But then they sent her immediately out to the civilian hospital there in that city, which I found alarming when I found out later. But she had to stay. My dad came home without her. They wanted to run some tests on her, and they had tried to put her under to do an endoscopy, but every time they put her under, her blood pressure dropped so low that she was going to die, so they brought her back out. So she ended up staying in the hospital. They kept trying at different times for a full week. The following Wednesday, this is the last Wednesday of the month now. These 3 Wednesdays in a row are significant to me. They finally were able to get her under and stabilized, and they did the endoscopy, and she was diagnosed with stage 4 stomach cancer. She came home the following day, Thursday night actually. She was discharged from the hospital, came home. Friday, I begged my mother to eat something because my mother was diabetic and I had taken her sugar and she needed to eat. And she did not want to, but she begrudgingly did. From the time my mother got home, she never spoke again. She never spoke. So I got her to eat something by crying. And we went through that day. Saturday morning, I got up and my dad and I got my mom to take her medicine. I believe it was either Oxycontin or oxycodone. I can't remember which. And it was a big pill, and she nearly choked to death that morning trying to take the pill. And we had arranged, we talked to the hospice workers, and they were going to come that evening and give her, feed a line, an IV in her medicine. You could push the button and she would get her medicine. So she nearly chokes to death on her medicine, and I look at my dad and I said, I'm just looking at my mom. And I know my mom. My mom and I had conversations many times, and my mom wanted to die. Like, she didn't kill herself. She wasn't, that ready to die. But her father had died very slowly of stomach cancer. It ate him away. It was very painful, and he suffered. And he did so that his wife would receive his Social Security checks. Held out as long as he could. And even when she was in the hospital before she came home, I told her, I said, it's okay. You do what you got to do. You go home. And she said, yeah, I don't know how my dad did this. It hurts so much. I'm not gonna hold on. Like, I'm gonna go. So I'm looking at her that morning, and I just look at my dad and I said, I'm not going to take her sugar anymore. I'm not going to test it. And he said, okay. We would help my mom lay down or sit up when she wanted, in those couple of days. And after taking her medicine and everything, she wanted to lay back down. Again, she didn't speak, but just knew. Like, she would look, or like you could just see in her eyes, like she was like me, and she could be very expressive with her facial expressions in her eyes. She wanted to lay down. We helped her lay down. Then I noticed liquid on my mom's skin. I thought maybe her catheter had come loose. I didn't really know what was happening. But my mom's sister, who has also passed since then, was a nurse. And my dad talked to her, and she said it was petechial hemorrhaging when we explained to her what was happening. So basically, there's so much liquid. Your body is holding so much liquid that it begins to sort of leak out of your pores of your skin. And it doesn't look like sweat or anything. It just looks like hers was yellow in color, like a dark yellow, even maybe a light brown, because she was jaundice. And so, it looked like urine leaking down her legs, but it wasn't. And she had this smell, and I think that's how I knew that it was my last day with her, even though I didn't consciously know it. I think on some level I knew. She smelled to me like a newborn baby. Not exactly the same, but very similar to what a newborn baby smells like. I bundled my son up, who was 6 at the time. My daughter, who was 10, or must have been 11, 10 or 11. Yes, she was 11. She was with her father. And I grabbed my son, put him in the car, and we went to Walmart, and I bought him a Lego set. The boys were obsessed with Legos. And even though they're expensive, I have a lot of extra disposable income, but I took that $30 and bought him a Lego set. I wanted to get him the best one, the biggest one I could afford to get him at the time, so that he would be preoccupied. And we went back home, and I sent him upstairs, and that's what he did. He went into my bedroom and worked on his Lego set. Later in the day, my husband came home just long enough to drop my stepson, our second child, off. And he walked through the house, and she saw him, caught sight of him, and she said, "Hi, Seth." And he said, "Hi, Grammy," and went upstairs. And that's the only thing she ever said after leaving the hospital. That was the last thing my mother ever said. So the next thing that I did is I wanted to play some music for my mother that she loved, that I also liked, because we had a lot of music that we didn't like that the other did. So I played her some Roy Orbison and some Patsy Cline and just all the things I had available on my iPod. But I knew it wasn't loud enough because my mother was deaf in one ear. She had been since she was 16. So I went in the bedroom and tried to find anything that might be hers, because most of the music was my dad's. But I did find the Three Tenors or whatever. Actually, I think it might just be a Pavarotti CD. that I put in. But either way, I put the CD in and could turn it up loud enough where I knew she could hear it. And we let it play all the way through. And it went off on its own. And normally, that would just be all. It just went off. The machine doesn't turn off. It is my father's stereo. It doesn't turn off on its own. It doesn't replay. There'd just be silence. And for a while there was. My cousin came by to see my mom before she passed, and he was sitting there talking to my dad. And every time my dad would go to talk, the music would start again. And it was really loud because we had played it really loud for her. And so he would stop it. And this happened like 3 times before he just turned the whole thing off, the whole stereo off. But I was sitting in the corner snickering because my mother and father had a bad relationship. It was passive aggressive. It was abusive. It was not good. So I just knew the whole time that she was messing with him. He would go to talk to my cousin and the music would start. I thought it was very funny. My dad decided he wanted to go to the store. And looking at my mom, the look on her face was no. Like, her eyes got really big. Like, no, don't let him do that. So I told him she didn't want him to leave, so he didn't. And then shortly after, she started going into the stages of death. It took several hours, but at the end, she's sitting up in a chair, in a recliner. One of her dogs, the very intelligent dog, the border collie, came and sat and put her chin on my mother's knee and just sat there. And I was at my mother's side holding her hand, talking to her. And one of the last stages is agitation. And so she left the agitation state and she just sort of slumped. So I held her and I was rocking her. And I called in her father and her son, my brother, and all angels and just anybody who wanted to be there with her to come and collect her. And then I started singing to her. I sang the Iron Man chant by Bob Marley, which is about going home when your life is over. And so I was singing to her and crying. And she had her moment of clarity where she looked at me and I could tell she was telling me she was sorry. At this point, her fingers were blue, her lips were turning blue, and she struggled for a couple more breaths. But as soon as she had her moment of clarity and looked me in the eyes and then looked away again, her dog left. The dog got up and went and laid across the room. And then she struggled for the last few breaths. But I knew as soon as the dog left that she was gone. She wasn't there anymore. It was just the body. The body was trying to breathe. But my mother was gone. And she died. Immediately after her passing, I jumped in my car and drove over to see my daughter because my daughter and my mother were very close. And while I didn't want to ruin her weekend, I also didn't want her to come home and Grammy just not be there. As close as they were, I couldn't not tell her. I couldn't have her come home to that. So I went to her father's. He lives, I can literally walk to his house from my house, but, about a 10-minute drive from my dad's house where we were staying at the time. And when I hop in the car and I'm pulling out, the first thing that comes on the radio is Don't Fear the Reaper. Now, my mother absolutely hated that song, but it is so, I couldn't help but kind of giggle and cry at the same time because that is exactly her sense of humor. For her to tell me everything was okay in that way. I don't know. So I tell my little girl, I go back home and I'm devastated. I had a very interesting, complicated relationship with my mother, as most of us do our parents. She was both my best friend and my worst enemy at some times. So I had a really hard night. This is where the witchy tale kind of starts. I mean, it did already a little bit with the music, but the next morning when I woke up, there was, if you've heard the song In the Air Tonight by Phil Collins, you'll know that echo that happens. That's what I heard. I heard my mother's voice right beside my ear in this echo, and it said, I'm here. And I started crying, and after a minute I was able to kind of gather myself and get up. I kind of have neglected to mention my mother's state of appearance. I did mention the petechial hemorrhaging. I did mention that she was jaundiced. She was very jaundiced. Her skin was yellow. Her eyes were yellow. Her face was so swollen on that last day, last couple days, particularly the last day. Her eyes were swollen. And what I mean is not her eyelids around her eyes, but the whites of her eyes were swollen up around the iris. It was like they were blown up like little balloons in her eye. It was so weird. And it made me very uncomfortable to look at it. The next morning when I woke up after my mother's death, I got up and I stumbled over and I'm looking in the mirror. And I don't even know why I'm looking in the mirror, honestly, because it's not a normal thing for me to do first thing when I get up, because I was still in the bedroom looking in like the full body. And I was horrified. And I had to call my husband to come and look at me because it was horrifying. My face was swollen, particularly on the right side where I had slept. My eye was swollen, the same exact way hers was. My whites of my eyes were puffy and swollen up around my iris, like little balloons in my eye. And they were jaundiced, my eyes, not my whole body. And it was all worse on the right side because I could think because I had slept on that side mostly all night. It freaked me out so bad. And that lasted nearly the whole day. After that, I was fine. But I was holding her when she died, and we were so connected, and I am an empath. I absorbed so much of her when she left. I started looking like my mother. I look like my mother to an extent. I never did, ever. When I was little, I looked so much like my dad. Actually, I looked like his sisters. I did not look like my mother at all. My brother did. And as I got older, I will admit that I looked a little more like her. But suddenly after she died, the resemblance was striking almost overnight. We had a man come to the house who was friends with my parents. He came a couple weeks after she passed to pay his respects. And when I opened the door for him, he literally jumped back in shock. I scared the crap out of this man because he thought I was my mother. Younger, but my mother, who he knew to be dead. So a couple weeks go by, probably a week or two. Three of my aunts, my dad's sisters, have flown out, and we have her ashes, and we're going to do what we do when people die. We don't really do a funeral. We just release the ashes. And I had not planned on, I'm pissed off. I'm pissed off that my mom died in like a matter of 3 days. And I had nothing planned, wasn't going to say anything. But years before, my dear soul sister, who named me She Who Walks Between the Worlds, had shared a story with me. I used to do these things that I would call a walkabout, which I know, that's an Australian thing, and I'm sorry if that's disrespectful, but that's what I called it, when I would just go walking and be open to messages from spirit and just sort of do a walking meditation. And on one of these walks, I found a blue jay feather on the ground, and I don't know why, but I automatically thought, ooh, I need to give this to my soul sister. And so I did. And when I handed it to her, her reaction, she's a sweet 70-year-old little lady, and she's just like, oh, Drew, do you know what you've given me? And I'm like, no. So she tells me the story. Blue jay feathers were special with her and her mother. And after the story, this whole moving story, I said, oh my gosh, blue jay feathers will always symbolize the relationship between a mother and her children to me from now on. And I had shared the story with my mother. We're walking out to where we're going to release the ashes, and I'm walking with my children holding her ashes, and there at our feet is a feather, and it's turned upside down. But I bent down and picked it up, and it was a blue jay feather. And I didn't have to say anything because my children knew the story too, and they immediately understood the symbol just like I did. And so when we got to the place to release the ashes, I shared that story with everyone who was there, and they started blubbering, and because it was obvious to me that my mother was telling us that she was with us and that she saw us and she was there. Not long after that, at that time, we had a Brita pitcher, a filter for our water, for our drinking water, and we kept it in a little mini fridge, and we'd all fill up our water bottles out of it. And I'm drinking from my water bottle, and I'm like, what's wrong with my water? And I give it to my husband. I ask him to taste it. I'm like, it tastes herby, right? Like there's herbs in it. And he was like, yeah, that's weird. So rinse it out, wash the bottle, get more water. Same thing. What the heck? So now I'm tasting other people's water. My kids, my husband's. Nobody's water tastes like herbs, only mine. So my husband's like, okay, I don't know. So he takes the pitcher and he washes it out. He changes the filter and does it again. And once again, I get water and my water tastes like herbs. Nobody else's does. And at some point, this only happened for like 3 days, maybe, I don't know, it was a few days. Toward the end of this experience, I realized what it tastes like, and it tasted like lavender, my mother's favorite. And so I'm sitting with my husband, and I'm like in astonishment. I'm like, oh my God, it's lavender. And he tastes it, and he's like, you're right. And I start crying because I'm like, that's Mom's favorite, lavender. Like she always bathed in lavender. And from that point on, it didn't happen anymore. And again, I felt like my mother changed my water again to let me know that she was still with me. The last thing that happened with regards to my mother and her passing was, it was probably a few months after her death. I woke up in the middle of the night, and it was one of those times when my eyes just snapped open and I'm staring into the corner of the room, and it's like a black and white version of my mother when she was much younger, just sort of staring at me. And I know immediately that this is supposed to be, like, I know that that's supposed to be my mother. And I just said, you're not my mom, get out. And I went back to sleep and didn't think anything else of it. But actually, I came to a deeper understanding of that situation upon contemplating it later and sitting with it. The feeling of it, what it looked like, the whole exchange, why it was in the house, why it was looking at me. I understood that was my mother's shadow. That a vast majority of the bullshit we collect on this earth is left here when we leave. It stays behind. So that's my understanding of the situation anyway. Yeah, basically that's it. That's my experience surrounding my mother's death and the ways that she came to me after her death to comfort me. This is really long. I apologize, guys. I appreciate it if you hung out through the whole thing. Thanks so much, as always. And until next time, much love and gratitude.